Good morning, everyone, and welcome to researchEDHome. Today we have a very special session. We have 4 teachers from the Yoke National Academy who have been creating countless video lessons and along the way have learned an awful lot. So this morning they will very kindly share with us some of the tips and some of the ways in which they organise content to make sure that it has some impact on students' learning. So I'm very, very excited to welcome them all. They are giving us their time on top of delivering the sessions and working for their own schools. So I feel very, very grateful. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Tilly if you want to start.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tilly Brown. I'm the acting primary head teacher at Reach Academy Feltham. I'm very excited to be with you all this morning, along with some of my colleagues from the Yoke National Academy. The Yoke National Academy is a free website of pre-recorded videos created by teachers for teachers to provide online learning across key stages and across curriculum areas, alongside some specialist provision videos that we're also hosting and providing. Thus far, we've had about over 6 million views and many trials and errors along the way, which we are very excited to share with you all this morning. So as a result, our talk is entitled Teaching from My Kitchen Table, Lessons Learned. I'm sure I'm not alone in the fact that lots of us have been doing very similar things throughout this slightly strange lockdown period. So before we start, I'd really like all of us to take a moment to think about what have the challenges been that we've all come into contact with when it comes to online learning. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds just to jot a few down or have a think about some that you've come into contact with. Great. So we had a discussion, obviously, before this, many discussions before we started this talk, and we really saw these as coming into 3 key areas. The first is technology, not only for pupils, but also for teachers. So with teachers, a lot of us, up until about 7 weeks ago, had not recorded lessons online, had not kind of been familiarised with the different ways and the different technology that you can do that with. But alongside that, we know that pupils are potentially accessing a lot of the content on their phones. They might have one device that they're sharing across many siblings, alongside having parents working from home, and the issues that can raise with regards to Wi-Fi and internet accessibility. So that's one that we've been really thinking about. Another one is assessment for learning. I know in my own classroom, I'm always looking out, and if the sea of faces looks blank, or if half of them are looking out the window, that's a real cue to me that maybe they haven't understood something, or I need to show a change of pace. With assessment for learning, it's really easy to think that you're constantly doing an amazing job as you teach to the camera. So that's another thing that we've been thinking about, and another real challenge when it comes to online learning. And finally, the environment. In our classrooms and in our schools, we can curate an environment that is calm, peaceful, and conducive to learning for our students. At home, this is not always the case. A lot of our families, and I know this from my own school, are juggling working from home parents, childcare, children doing different online videos, different online learning at different times. And so therefore, we've got to be really mindful of the environment and the impact this has on online learning, and how we can take that into account when designing our videos. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Ellie, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about the theory that we've been thinking about when it comes to online learning.
Thank you, Tilly. So hi, I'm Ellie Speman. I'm a religious studies teacher at Bennett Memorial School. I'm going to be talking to you today about cognitive load theory, which I think is even more pertinent to discuss in the current climate. So there are, of course, as Tilly described, several challenges to remote learning. However, these challenges are not dissimilar to challenges we might face in the classroom or sending a student off at the end of the day with homework. So how can we actually ensure that students are learning while they are at home? What gives us the best tools to achieve this? Now, in 2017, Dylan William tweeted, "I've come to the conclusion Sweller's cognitive load theory is the single most important thing for a teacher to know." While this was tweeted in 2017, cognitive load theory is not new. It's attributed to Sweller, who developed the theory in 1988. In short, cognitive load theory refers to the amount of information that working memory can hold at one time. Our working memory has limited capacity. It's thought to hold around 5 to 9 chunks of information in young adults and less in children. Therefore, our methods of teaching should avoid overloading the working memory, as cognitive overload disrupts the working memory from processing new information. It's important that when we are planning as teachers, we make sure we are choosing the activities for our students that directly contribute to learning and avoid those tasks which contribute to extraneous load. In short, we want to be setting tasks that do not require a student to be using their working memory to work out what the task is asking them to do, which will take away from the actual content. We'll talk more about those later, but I'm now going to ask you to complete a task for me. So firstly, I'd like you to remember these 5 numbers. I'm going to give you approximately 1 minute to try and memorize them, but I don't want you to write them down. I want you to simply try and see if you can remember what's on your screen. So you've got about a minute now. Okay, thank you. Next, I'd like you to complete these 3 tasks. I want you to count backwards from 10 in your head. I want you to calculate 8 times 4. And I want you to recall the last 5 letters of the alphabet in your head. Okay, good. Now I want you to write down or say to yourself the 5 numbers that I asked you to remember. Okay, here are the numbers I asked you to memorize. Did you find this difficult? Perhaps maybe you recited the numbers to yourself over and over. Perhaps you just stared at the screen, just willing them to imprint in your memory. It's unlikely that you can recall all 5 numbers. Either way, I wanted to model to you what it's like when you're cognitively overloaded, when your working memory is struggling to process items simultaneously. This is what we want to avoid when we are teaching. The diagram you can see on your screen now is an adaptation of Daniel Willingham's memory model. The environment is you, the teacher, giving information which is fed into the working memory of the child. As the working memory is limited, some things will be forgotten if work is not done to commit it to long-term memory. Working memory can only really deal with one cognitively challenging task at a time. If you want to commit learning to long-term memory, which is said to be infinite, then attention is really important. Small distractions will reduce the chance of a new concept being transferred to long-term memory. Without attention, there is no learning. Take this for an example. When I had a rental car after mine broke down, which happens all of the time, I noticed that every time I reversed, it would automatically turn down the volume of my music. This was to aid my concentration and to reduce the distractions I faced when I was trying to reverse. So learning is more than just covering something in a lesson and remembering it the next day. In the learning curriculum published by the Institute for Teaching, learning is defined as a change in knowledge and skill which is inferred at some point after teaching. So a good example might be if a student remembers and uses the correct formula to find an area of a circle 1 year after they were taught it. So unless we do things to commit information to long-term memory, it will be forgotten. So what can we do to help commit things to long-term memory? Miriam, Tilly and James will give you some helpful examples soon. But briefly, I will mention that part of this is done through building schemas. Now, schema is a Greek word in origin and it means plan. Essentially, a schema is a general idea about something. It's a memory trace that can hold simple and more complex information. Schemas are built by experience and they're constantly changing, constantly revised when new information has been learned. So for example, as a young child, you might see a cat and your schema for a cat would be a furry creature, 4 legs and a tail. You then might see different colours of cats or cats with different fur lengths and your schema for a cat is revised. However, you then come across a dog and recognise there are other animals that are furry with 4 legs and a tail. Your schema for a cat is then revised alongside a new schema for a dog, and you can then build an animal schema that includes both cats and dogs, recognising that they are different species. A helpful way of visualising what a schema is thinking about a filing cabinet. When we learn something, it's filed away in a schema, which we can access, revise, change, etc. When strong schemas are in place, they're what we call automated. They don't require your working memory. So your working memory is then freed up for new information. Therefore, one of the most powerful things we can do while teaching is to activate schemas, activate prior knowledge, to make them think about things already known so these can be built upon. We can link old material to new material so schemas can be built. So for example, when teaching Islam, this might be then added to your religion schema. We can also link different schemas together. And the earlier we can do this, the better, so that students are equipped with strong schemas. It is, however, also possible to file away information incorrectly into a schema. So we as teachers play a crucial role in helping students to build their schemas correctly and provide the correct knowledge to students. Some of the best ways of building schemas is by deliberate practice. Not just reading or repeating something, or when a student says, but I looked at these 10 pages of notes and I still don't remember it, but purposeful and systematic practice. It requires focused attention. It requires direct instruction from the teacher in how to complete this effectively. So Miriam, Tilly and James will be covering what this may look like in practice. But to make sure you take away the most important aspects of cognitive load theory today, I would like you to pause and consider this question. Which of the following statements are true? 1, working memory and long-term memory is limited. 2, learning is more than just covering something and remembering it the next day. And 3, deliberate practice is key for remembering material. I want you to write down or in your head, think about which of those statements are true, please. Give you about 30 seconds. Okay, good. We should have answered that 2 and 3 are the true statements. 1 is false. Long-term memory is said to be infinite, while working memory is limited. Long-term memory is said to be infinite. Miriam is now going to explain some of the ways we can apply cognitive load theory to remote learning.
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, I'm Miriam. I'm also a religious education teacher and I work with Ellie at Bennett Memorial in Kent. And we've been working with cognitive load theory for a while. But how do we put this practice into our online teaching? As Tilly said, one of the key challenges with remote teaching is that we can't control the environment in which students are learning to reduce extraneous load on their working memory. In the classroom, I can ensure that students are working in silence and that they have no distractions. But when they're learning remotely from home, they might be surrounded by screaming siblings, they might be trying to share different devices, etc., etc. So they've got a lot of distractions whilst they're trying to learn. Even so, we can reduce the strain on students' working memory in the kind of tasks that we set for students. Rosenshine offers 17 key principles for the classroom which help to put cognitive load theory into practice. And I would be going against the theory if I was to talk about all 17. Instead, I'm going to focus on 2, which I think we've integrated most successfully into our remote teaching, which are to start the lesson with a short review and to obtain a high success rate of student understanding. And I'm also going to talk about how we can reduce extraneous load for students in the tasks which we set for student practice, which is going to fit well with several of Rosenshine's principles. So firstly, start the lesson with a short review. Rosenshine says, review is an important component of instruction. Review can help us to strengthen the connections between material that we have learned, and the review of previous learning can help us to recall words, concepts and procedures effortlessly and automatically when we need this material to solve problems or to understand new material. Essentially, when we're reviewing, we're getting students to recall their developing schemas and to strengthen them so that new material can be understood and added. In school, we normally do this with a quiz at the beginning of each lesson, and this is something that translates really well online. Each lesson at Oak begins with a multiple question quiz, which tests students on the previous lesson's learning or any prior learning that's going to be relevant to that day. I'm personally in the habit of also recapping verbally what we did in the previous lesson, which works particularly well in RE as it's often very story focused. It's a bit like having that recap at the beginning of an episode of a soap or something like that. And all of this works to bring the developing schema into working memory. Multiple choice questions rather than open answer questions are particularly useful here as it gives students the necessary prompt. We're all familiar with that ourselves, that once something is prompted in our memory, we're then able to recall a lot more. For example, if you were to pick a song and ask me to tell you all the lyrics, I'd probably start off by spending some time just trying to remember the song in the first place. But if you were to play me the first line of the song, I would almost instantly be able to very badly sing the rest of the lyrics. That prompt brings that song schema back into working memory very, very easily so that your mind is freed up to think about new material. This is exactly what a multiple choice quiz does for students. It brings everything into their working memory so that they can then start adding new information to their schemas. So the first principle is we should be recapping both in our introductions, verbally and through quizzes to help students recall and strengthen the relevant schemas. Secondly, we want to obtain a high success rate. By a high success rate, Rosenshine explains that a highly successful teacher will ensure that each student has learnt material correctly before they practice it. If we as teachers come across misunderstandings in the classroom, we should pause and reteach these mistakes before they are committed to long-term memory. However, this is a challenge online as I've got no way of knowing whether or not a student has understood my explanations or come away with some bizarre misunderstanding. One way to overcome this is using techniques such as look, cover, write, check, repeat. We actually use this a lot for homework tasks in my school because it's a really good way for students to practice what they have learnt in lessons without teacher input. We're really direct in how we would like students to complete the tasks, and we say exactly how it should be carried out and exactly what students should be learning. We will then regularly test students as the forced recall helps to get that new information into their long-term memory. There's a couple of examples on the slide of the sort of things that we might get students to learn using this technique. It's particularly good for key definitions and quotations or key facts. It's one of those things that students don't love. They tend to groan when the task is set, but over time they do recognise how effective it is. It's really worthwhile, and actually it's worth explaining to students why we do that technique. I will often say to students, well, I don't remember these things instantly. I have to practice quotations. I don't just know them, and therefore they're exactly the same. And this should help students' self-efficacy to know that they are going to be able to commit these things to memory if they follow the process of this technique. Another thing that this is going to be useful for is anticipating mistakes that students make. We all know that students can be very inventive with the kind of misunderstandings that they come up with, but as subject specialists, we can anticipate common mistakes that students make. So I know, for example, that students tend to get confused about succession in Islam. So if you look at my final example there, it says Muhammad is the final prophet in Islam, future leaders are not prophets. Now that key fact is designed around student misunderstanding. I know they get confused around succession, so that's what I'm going to give them for cover, write, check, repeat to overcome that misunderstanding. And this way we can ensure that students are not building an incorrect schema whilst they're learning independently. Thirdly, we want to support students in practicing the new information they're learning. And this can be really challenging in a remote setting when we can't be there to rescue them when they've lost track of what they should be doing. One of the biggest challenges for students when practicing new information is trying to hold several things in their head at once, just as Ellie demonstrated earlier when she asked us to remember those numbers. I definitely could not keep them all in my head whilst doing some basic maths. Rosenshine says, our working memory, the place where we process information, is small. It can only handle a few bits of information at once, and too much information swamps our working memory. This is going to relate to pause points and chunking, which is going to be discussed later by Tilly and James. But I'm going to talk about how we can manage the working memory through the tasks that we set. How often as teachers do we have students say, I just don't get it? And when we ask them to be more specific, you know, what exactly don't you get? They just gesture vaguely to the whole room. Now, in RE and philosophy, I've long given up the hope that this is a deep existential question, as it's usually just task related. Generally, you then have a back and forth with the student for a while to discover what part of the task they're not sure about. And it is often more about the task than it is about misunderstanding the content. Understanding the task itself can be a huge demand on cognitive load. I know that we've all wanted to try something a bit different at times when teaching, and there's definitely approaches to teaching which focus on doing new and interesting tasks like carousels, etc. But what we found in my department is that this tends to lead to the students spending more time thinking about the task rather than thinking hard about the new information that we actually want them to learn. For this reason, we now use standard tasks in RE and philosophy. For example, in philosophy, once we get onto looking at different philosophical arguments, all of our handouts look pretty much exactly the same. Now, this means that after our first 2 or 3 lessons where we're teaching the students how to do the tasks on the handout, I no longer have to explain to them what they need to do. I explain the new content that I want them to learn, I give them the handouts, and they just begin because the task is familiar to them and they know what they're supposed to be doing. Their working memory is freed up to grapple with the new information. I think this is even more important when we're remote teaching, particularly as we're catering to students that we don't know. In RE, we're doing this mostly through the questions we're asking. Most tasks are to answer short answer questions on what they have read or listened to, which then build up to longer explain questions. It's not reinventing the wheel, but that's the point. Why make little Timmy try and understand how this new information fits into a Venn diagram when he could simply answer some comprehension questions? Unless, of course, the point of the lesson is learning about Venn diagrams. So I've got a couple of examples of standard tasks that you might use in different subjects. In humanities, like I said for RE, I think reading and answering comprehension questions is a really useful task. In languages, look, cover, write, check, repeat will be really helpful for learning key vocab. And in sciences, you might get them to do something like write down 5 key facts from what they have learnt or read, and that could then lead on to something like look, cover, write, check, repeat. So let's pause for a moment and review what we've looked at. On the screen, you have a matching task. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to decide which task fits with which question. Okay, let's have a look at the answers. So what task helps students to recall their schemas? You're going to want to use a quiz. What task helps students to learn key facts with a high success rate? Look, cover, write, check, repeat. And how do you reduce cognitive load when designing tasks? Well, we want to keep tasks familiar and simple. So I hope you're not cognitively overloaded. I'm now going to pass on to Tilly, who's going to talk more about how we can get students to engage remotely.
Great, thank you so much, Miriam. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about chunking and pause points. And this is something that we've been using throughout lessons at Oak across primary and secondary. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm from a primary background, so a lot of these examples are primary, but I hope you'll put up with me while I do that. So what is a pause point? A pause point is a technique that we use, and it is a short task after an explanation that makes the pupils do something with their new knowledge. It refers back to what Ellie was saying earlier about deliberate practice. And it's the idea that children require time to essentially do the key processing that needs to be done. And if we talk for too long without pause points, then fundamentally children are more likely to become overloaded. In the classroom, this is quite easy to tell when we maybe need to pause or recap an explanation, because the pupils give us cues. I mentioned earlier the child looking out the window, the blank faces, playing with their pen. And when we see those things, we're automatically trained to adapt our teaching accordingly, to recap information or ask the children to do a really quick task before we continue with our explanation. Online, this is more difficult. Instead, we need to start with our knowledge from the classroom about misconceptions that the pupils often have about this information, or about content that we know pupils find difficult. I'm sure we're all familiar with that feeling of going into a lesson and thinking, oh, this might be a slog. I know children find this really hard. And we desperately need all that knowledge and take it into online learning. I think when I first started, I sort of saw every lesson as a new lesson, and this was a new thing, and I'm an online teacher, whereas before I've been an in-person teacher. Well, no, fundamentally, all the knowledge I have as an in-person teacher is vital. So we use that knowledge of misconceptions and difficult content, and we plan backwards, and we pre-plan in pause points, those short tasks after an explanation that are going to give children processing time and also exposure to potential misconceptions that we think they might have. So I'm going to explain what these pause points might look like, but before we do that, how do you tee up effective pause points? Well, for these things, I find two of Doug Lemov's key techniques really helpful. Firstly, his what to do when it comes to instructions, and secondly, his positive training. So to model, positive framing, let me show you what that would look like. I might start with the sentence, I'm excited for you to show me what you've learned. That's the positive framing. Then moving into the what to do instructions. Answer the question, who is the main character in this story? Please use a full sentence, the main character is, pause the video now and answer that question. At this point, and this took quite a lot of trial and error, you need to pause long enough for the children to find the pause button. On Oak, I teach Year 1 English, and I realised fairly quickly, thanks to some helpful feedback from parents who were using the resources, that 3 seconds was not enough time for a pupil to pause a video. So making sure you leave time for them to find the pause button. Once they've done that, you then debrief. So you should have written, the main character is Jack. And as we talk through different pause point options, I'm going to go through how important it is after the first question is posed. So, what are the different pause points that we could use? I've organised and chosen 5 key pause points. I'm sure there are many, and you're probably using a lot in your videos if you're creating content already. The way I've structured it is how I might use them in the progression of a lesson, almost like a story. So the first one is call and response. This is the one that we use really regularly in the primary classroom, and it's really good for teaching key vocabulary. And that's the reason why we do it at the beginning of lessons. We know that children need familiarity with key vocabulary and a chance to practice it before they move into the bulk of the learning, where that vocabulary is going to be used throughout. Let me show you an example. This is an example of a maths lesson, and these are the star words, which are the key words that we're using. So as a teacher, if I were to do this, I might say tens, ones, and I'm using my hands on the screen to indicate when I want the children to repeat the information back to me. I would also pre-plan in definitions that I would use, and you explain these as I went along. Here's another example. This is from reception. I wonder what story this is. Can you tell your screen? That's another way that you can tee up call and response. We've been using tell your screen, or even with some of our children, tell your Teddy. I have mine here in case I need to tell him anything. So you could say, tell your Teddy what story you think this is on the screen. It's The 3 Bears and Goldilocks. And finally, we use call and response a lot when we're teaching phonics. We know that repetition is vital, but also that the children are saying the sound correctly. So we might say and do that repetition very early on in the lesson so that they're really familiar with the sound that we're teaching them. So They've got their vocabulary, they've got a really clear understanding of that. And I think it's really important to me at the moment, we know in school, and particularly in the early years foundation stage, we put a lot of time into ensuring that we are developing children's communication and language in a really vocabulary rich environment. At home, this can be difficult. Some of our children will be speaking a language other than English that they speak at home. For others, they probably won't be having the same type of vocabulary instruction that we would give in school. So it is really important that we are identifying the key vocabulary that we want to teach and then using call and response to teach that in the early parts of our videos. The next one is identify. I think this is best for exposing children to new knowledge. This is not about them using the new knowledge or putting them into answer questions. It's literally about finding the new knowledge on the screen. We're going to jump back into reception phonics to see what this might look like in practice. So the sound for this lesson was D. And we start with this quite basic example and saying to the children, can you point to the letter D on the screen? And now. And now. You can see each time that the task is becoming a little bit harder because they're identifying the sound out of a greater selection of other sounds that they've also learned. So again, we're building that challenge into the task. And this is something that James is going to talk about later. Another example, and this is from a Year 1 geography lesson, is about identifying the continents by the shape of their land. Again, you can see, which I referred to earlier, that idea of giving the answers. So you've got Europe, asking them to identify the next one, and the next, and the next. And by bringing those answers in piece by piece, you're decreasing the number of options they've got as they move through. So now they've done a call and response, they've got their key vocabulary, they've had a go at identifying the new knowledge, and now we're moving into a question and answer part. We're looking about the children recalling key facts and new knowledge. It's what Miriam was speaking about, which is really successful in humanities, the use of comprehension questions. This is an example of a Year 1 English lesson. What does the word appearance mean? When it comes to question and answer, I think a couple of things are really important, but mainly that you pose one question and then give the answer before moving on to the next one. Where the questions build, you cause the risk of potentially, if they get the first question wrong, then they might get the second, third, fourth and fifth question wrong. Whereas if you give the question one and then the answer, you can help to put them back on the right path if they've got confused early on in the task. We've also been thinking really hard at Oak about how to use visuals to help children with finding the right answer. I also have another one here. This is from a geography lesson. You've got the smallest country in South America is Brazil. And each time you've got the answer going one after the other. South America is usually quite warm throughout the year with the answer given. Ships can sail through the Panama Canal and the answer, and then again, the answer straight away. Each time it's that question followed by an answer. What we're also developing when we use question and answer is the children to be more self-reliant and marking their own work. So we've done our question and answer. The next one is multiple choice. This is so important and so useful when it comes to addressing misconceptions, because in the answers that we give, we can often embed those misconceptions that we think children are likely to have, and therefore tee ourselves up to teach those to the pupils within our video and online learning. I've got an example here from a Year 2 English. A family of ducks out for an afternoon cruise. I wonder, could you take a moment to think, what is the misconception that children are likely to have when they read that statement? The key misconception is likely to be, they see the word cruise and they think, oh, I've heard of people going on a cruise. That's when they go on a boat. So maybe the ducks were on a boat, which would be option 1. Or maybe they're quacking at the boat, which would be option 4. By putting those misconceptions in, the teacher is teeing themselves up to effectively address them and give the children the chance to identify the correct answer, which in this example would be paddling on the river, helping them to understand that an afternoon cruise doesn't necessarily mean that you're on a boat, particularly if you're a family of ducks. And finally, we move on to our short writing task. This is something that I would usually use towards the end of a lesson. It's a really good way of challenging pupils to put the new ideas or key knowledge they've learned into their own words, and it is one of the most difficult. It's really important when we're doing a short writing task that we think about how we set children up for success. I don't know about you, but I often in a classroom think I've done a really great explanation and then say, okay, off you go, start the task. and nobody touches their pencil or pen. It's quite frustrating. And I think if that happens in the classroom when I'm standing at the front, how much more likely is it to happen at home? So as a result, it's really important that when we do give children a writing task, we ease them into the process through scaffolding and modelling. And James is going to talk about this in a moment. I've got an example here from a Year 8 science lesson. Why does water move up a plant's stem? And the teacher has given the children sentence starters to ease them into that writing process and ensure that they're going to experience that really high success rate that we know is really important. Number 1, the water is absorbed by. Number 2, it travels up. And number 3, then in the leaves it. It also serves the purpose of recapping that knowledge that she's just taught. So I have a pause point for you. I would like you to, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds, to write down what are the 5 pause points that we just came up with. And I've given you some tips on the screen in case you are worried about picking up your pen or pencil. I'll give you a minute to answer those now. Okay, so I've got call and response for teaching of vocabulary, identify when it's that new introduction of knowledge, question and answer to draw upon that knowledge further, multiple choice questions to identify those misconceptions, and a short writing task to challenge pupils to put that new knowledge or new ideas into their own words. I'm now going to hand over to James, who's going to talk about models and feedback.
Thank you, Tilly. I'm James Dyke, so I'm Acting Head of English at Dixon's Trinity Chapel Town in Leeds. And I'm going to be kind of focusing on the role and the function of models and feedback in our video lessons. So we've obviously looked at sort of the underlying principles of cognitive load theory behind how we might plan and prepare for online lessons. And obviously Tilly's taken us through how we might sequentially plan and use pausing and chunking throughout the lesson. And this is very much what comes next. So how do we tee students up for more independent practice or slightly more extended tasks? And also how do we kind of tackle that sort of sticky situation around feedback and how we actually mark work, how we give them meaningful feedback when we're not live in the room. So I'd like to think about it from 2 different angles. So firstly, models to scaffold. So this very much links back to what we've seen so far, where we've seen that use of chunking, and we've decided that obviously in online lessons that chunking and scaffolding is even more pertinent than normal due to our lack of presence, and therefore what needs to come throughout that kind of process is modelling throughout each section. And I'd like to sort of also kind of argue that we need to model more than we would normally, smaller steps, which we found particularly useful delivering OAK lessons, and delivering sections of examples of your own, which you wouldn't necessarily do in a classroom as much, but need to be done more often throughout the lesson. And obviously, secondly, thinking about that issue of feedback and combating the problem of not being able to see what students have produced. Now, there's an underlying principle, which I would like us to sort of consider as well throughout this, and that we need to think about the fact that we're not in control of a lot in this situation in terms of video lessons. We're not in control of motivating the students directly in the room. We can't be there to speak to them directly. So we need to think about where that's coming from. And we very much decide as an English team that a lot of our motivation and encouragement comes through the content, because that is the one thing we can control. And therefore our models need to always have that really high standard of expectation, really high quality, through every single example that we write and that we give the students, and what we expect them to produce needs to be a driver of that motivation and set those expectations, whether it's for a larger task or a smaller chunk task. So that's something which we very much make sure is underpinning all of our models. So let's think about Rosenshine again. Models permeate really a lot of his principles. So obviously we've got that providing of scaffolds for difficult tasks that involves modelling, even on a smaller level. We've got that guiding of student practice, so sort of shorter tasks. Again, some bits of modelling there. It might be sentence starters, it might be writing frames. And of course, one of his actual principles is to provide models, and that might be a fully worked example, an end product, which might be unpicked, or it might be something which you use to give feedback on. So models are crucial within many other aspects of instruction. So let's see an example of a task then. So in this case, this is an example of where we might use modelling for something which is a bit shorter, maybe an example of guided practice. Here, students have been practicing grammar. So they've been doing a lesson on brackets and dashes and their purpose. And this is within a greater unit around Greek myths. So there's quite a challenging domain which they're having to kind of grapple with at the same time. Now, in this particular task, students simply have to think about how they must finish the sentence off based on the punctuation that's being used. So they're having to think about quite a few things. They're having to think about, first of all, well, what are the content of those sentences? So I need to use my knowledge of Greek myths to answer that. But also I need to use that knowledge of punctuation as well to make sure it's accurate. In order to lighten that load and to model what you want them to really produce, the sentences are just partially complete. And that really does lighten the load a little bit in terms of what they do have to think of. But it also models implicitly under the surface lots of vocabulary, which is always something which is constantly needing to be fed to students. And this would be building towards a bigger writing task, like a description. So what's also being modeled to the students are ideas and things that they might want to include later. So really, whilst your modeling might be guiding, it should also be implicitly feeding students with lots and lots of ideas, bearing in mind you're not with them to just kind of jump in with those kind of things in a classroom. So making sure your video is rich with these ideas, rich with vocabulary through your models is really key. Let's have a look at what the last two questions would look like. Now, these are just the final two questions of that task where the model has disappeared completely. So it's kind of faded away. And we've talked previously a little bit about that idea of fading to up the challenge and allow students a little bit of independent time. But there's still a little bit of guidance there. There's just no modeling anymore. And let's think about the setting up of a more substantial task. So in this context, Year 9 have been doing some analysis on Frankenstein. So they're writing a paragraph exploring how the monster is presented. So thinking about this contextually, students have had lots of preceding learning here. They've been taught, obviously, the text. They've had to understand the vocabulary, some of the quite complicated concepts that surround Gothic writing, such as the uncanny. So they've had lots of preparation and they've had lots of practice leading up to this of certain aspects of analytical writing. They'll have practiced, exploring connotations, retrieving quotations. So this is the point where we want them to really produce something substantial, like an essay or an extended paragraph. Now, you'll notice that the model isn't full, so I've not given them a full example. And that's partly because at this stage, it's probably quite important not to overload the students further with a full example to unpick before they then do it. That could be quite jarring. We will explore how students might use that to support later. But in this case, the model just simply has the opening. So it has a first sentence, and it also kind of starts to develop it a little bit, but students then just have to carry it on. And what that's allowing students to do is to be motivated by the fact that there's a bit of support there, which sets quite a high standard of response, and also that they should feel supported through the beginning of a model, which then is gradually just taken away. So really what's happening now is maybe in a normal classroom, you might spend time with students unpicking certain things in a visualizer, maybe a full response, or you might live model. Whereas here it's maybe more useful based on technological constraints to just give them part of one and then strip it away. And the practice that leads up to it should have been more supportive. Let's look at the same task in a different context. So this is exactly the same task. However, the model is slightly different. So this is essentially just a writing frame instead. So there's just sentence starters which help to structure each section of the paragraph. So you might use this with a different, if you know your class really well, or you feel like you've maybe got a more middle or lower prior attaining group, you might think about using something which scaffolds each stage of a paragraph more. So it's more of a writing frame, but it has less content within it. So just like the last example, we're not overloading on the content and giving them too much to borrow and use and stress about understanding first. We're just simply giving the starting points of each section to encourage them to complete a full paragraph and do a good job of that. Let's look at a final example for this task. Here is again the same task, but the model is taken away entirely. So essentially what you're left with is just a success criteria. And this is something you might use at the stage where you've done some examples of analysis previously. So maybe you've done plenty of analysis and students should be, and you want them to be, confident at structuring their own analytical paragraphs. So you just need to give them the prompt at this stage. So the modeling is gradually stripped away. And again, that really depends on your audience and depends on your knowledge of your class. At Oak, obviously, our audience is kind of unlimited, and we don't really know what students we've got in front of us at all times. So I would probably tend to go for the writing frame, because I know that every student can access that and use that effectively. And those students that might not need as much scaffolding can still do their own thing with that, or could adapt it themselves. So you've got to try and think about that audience and that class that you've got. Okay. Now, so just to kind of summarize this section, 3 kind of key points about models as scaffolds. And again, I'd like to stress that there's nothing particularly revolutionary here. There's nothing too new. It's about adapting good practice for the context of video lessons. So modeling with really high expectations of students. So that's in the content that you deliver and give them, because that implicitly shows them the expectations of what you want them to produce. Model each smaller stage, maybe more often than you would, and practice plenty before more extended independent tasks, just to lighten that load when it gets to that point. And fading models away to also lighten the load in terms of content and what they're seeing on screen is really, really key. So writing frames are a really great tool for video lessons. So in the spirit of pause points, just 2 sentences I'd like you to finish off. So you could write them down, you could do it in your head. And I'm not going to test you on them or anything like that. Just finish each sentence off, which will just allow you to sort of cement a little bit of what I've spoken about so far. So about 40 seconds, have a go at that. Okay, let's have a little think about feedback then to move forward. So I really like this quotation from Tom Sherrington. And again, it's just a basic principle of what feedback is and its purpose. So feedback only succeeds. Students trust it, use it to increase their effort or raise their aspirations, and as a result, improve performance. So that raised questions for me in terms of, well, what do we do to enable that in the video lesson context? How can we ensure that students are using feedback appropriately? How can we ensure that they are actually improving their performance or doing what we say in terms of the feedback? And ultimately, there's not a straight up answer of, well, you can do this. There's not really a guarantee here. However, there's couple of quotations which I think are really useful in allowing us to think about, well, how can we make the most of feedback generally? And these are 2 quotations based on what feedback, useful feedback is. So positive and specific. So we're going to really think about how we can, again, be motivational through our feedback, and positive in terms of how to encourage students to do a really good job. And also specifics, and look at misconceptions. And obviously focusing forwards, because ultimately we need to show students, well, what do they need to do next? We need to ensure that's still happening, despite not being with them in the room, and teaching them in our classrooms as normal. So let's think about misconceptions, and we've touched upon misconceptions previously, and how we might sort of plan for those. Now, in this case, in terms of giving more global extended feedback, misconceptions are probably the thing that worries us the most, because normally we're used to being very responsive in a classroom. We're used to looking at what students are producing or not producing and the mistakes they're making, and really responding live in the lesson. And that usually is the most powerful form of feedback. Obviously, we can't do that. So what do we do instead? And it's all about really modeling misconceptions as we go through. And when you give feedback, it's about planning, using that subject expertise. well, what are the likely things that students will have found difficult? And that can be quite extensive, especially in a subject like English, where you could have all of your students making quite different mistakes at different points. So it's all about, if anything, maybe over-planning misconception feedback so you can catch as many students as possible. And even the ones who don't need all of that feedback, they're getting important, recaps, they're getting important mastery of key knowledge and key processes anyway. So that's not too much of a problem. Let's see an example in action. So in this particular example, students had been practicing different sentence structures and punctuation. So that had been something they've been learning about for a series of lessons, again, in the context of Greek myths. And their job in this task was to just describe or to write about one of the myths that they learned, and then they were trying to implement different pieces of punctuation and sentence structures successfully as a form of practicing them. So what I did, I produced this example. So I'll have set that task up for students without this example. I haven't shown them this before they've written it. I've maybe used a writing frame. They've done lots and lots of practice. What I'm showing them at this point is the feedback. So what I would have wanted was students to have completed the task, and then they're getting to this. And you can see underneath, that's where I've scripted my particular feedback for what I wanted to say to them. So I've written in quite a bit of detail what I want to point out. So I've made sure that my example includes the successes that students should have really got to, and I'll hold them to that account and say, you need to make sure you've got this. And as I do that, I'm also highlighting and explaining to them how to check the little errors. So for example, I might say, as you can see, I've used an adverb at the start of one of my sentences there, courageously. Just give yourself a tick if you've used that adverbial opener, but also just check and highlight, just like I've done, that you've used a comma afterwards, because often I see students forgetting to use that comma. So can you just make sure you've got that comma? So I'm narrating a success and what I expect to see in their work, but I'm just reminding them, based on a common misconception, of something else they should have done. Similarly, I might say, if you've used a colon or a semicolon there, just check you've used a lowercase in the word that comes after it, because sometimes people use capital letters. Not a proper noun, make sure it's a lowercase. So I'll be narrating through all the tiny possible issues that they may have sort of had. And that's really important, that we over-narrate that feedback to catch as many students as possible. Of course, with your classes, you probably know what kind of issues might come up, so you'll be able to be a bit more directed. Let's think about a really important question then, because in this case, I've not really used a model before the task. I've simply brought it up afterwards to review the work. So really, when should we use models in video lessons? And I was having a really careful think about this. You've got the option of obviously using one beforehand, and that is your scaffolding. So maybe that's a writing frame. Maybe you actually do want to unpick a full response beforehand if you feel like it would be appropriate. In English, I tend to find that might be overwhelming on a video, but maybe it works for you. You could, and I like to do this in the classroom, is use a model and give feedback mid-task, where you actually stop students, respond to what you've seen so far, and urge them on and correct any issues and move them forward. And then ultimately that post-practice or post-task model or feedback is based on that, successes, improvements, misconceptions. Let's look at one more example, and I'd like to explain how we might change that process. So this is an example of an analytical paragraph which came from that task about Frankenstein that you saw earlier. I'm just going to give you a moment just to have a read of that, just the beginning of it. Now, don't worry if you've not read it all, it's absolutely fine, but hopefully you've kind of recognized that the model example that is being given to students here is quite challenging, and it very much has high expectations of what they can produce. So that is really underlying there. Now, the question I posed earlier was, when should we use a model? So let's consider that for a second. With this particular example, with this particular example, we might, if we want to use it beforehand, we can't control if a student were to just let the video resume and look at the example. If a student knows that Sir or Miss is going to end the lesson with an example, so when they tell me to start my task, I know that I can just let the video resume and I will see some good answers and some good examples. We're not really in control of that, and we have to be absolutely okay with students choosing to use the model, choosing to use the feedback in the way that they find most useful, because ultimately we can't really control it. So if a student were to use this and decide, right, I'm not going to do the independent task on my own, I'm going to actually wait for the SIRS model, then there's plenty of things in here which they can use to help structure their paragraph, and they can use it as a scaffold, they can use it as a helpful support. That's absolutely fine, I've not got a problem with that. If a student maybe lacks resilience and they spend 5 minutes having a go on their own, and they think, oh, you know what, I'll just resume the video and get some feedback and try and help me finish this paragraph off. Again, if that encourages students and if that supports students and motivates them to actually get it done, and they will learn stuff from my model, that is not a problem. I have to be okay with that too. And then I'm sure we'll also have plenty of students who will follow the instruction of just waiting till they're finished before they look at the example and mark it. And ultimately, we have to be comfortable with that reality. We're living in a situation in which students are probably lacking resilience. So anything that encourages, anything that motivates and allows them to get the job done and to a good standard, we have to accept that. So really the takeaway there is that we make sure our models can cater for all of those situations. However students wish to use a model, they're going to use it in the way that they wish. So let's make sure they can do that. So just as 3 final summaries from this feedback section. So making sure that our models and feedback motivate and encourage through that high expectations, which is very similar to previously. But again, the examples students will see are the examples of what you should want them to be able to produce themselves. And it should make them aspire to that. And it should address misconceptions, so plan out and script specific misconceptions. I can't stress the importance of scripting enough when you're planning your video lessons. And of course, feedback always needs to feed forward, so giving them that option to improve their work and really showing them what they can do next to really support that. I'm just going to hand you back over to Tilly.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to ask all of us speakers to come off mute and put their videos back on, and just each of us give you one key takeaway from our lessons learned at our kitchen tables about online learning. Ellie, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so my key takeaway is from the quotation from Daniel Willingham, which is memory is the residue of thought. The idea that in remote teaching, it's even more important that we're doing deliberate practice to help students build their schemas.
Miriam?
For me, the main thing to keep in mind when you're teaching online is to make sure that you're recapping and keeping the tasks really simple for student practice.
James?
For me, it's very much around that scripting of really specific feedback, which is encouraging, but also holds students to really high standard in order to motivate them through your models.
Great, and for me, it was to plan in a variety of pause points, and each time you ask the children to pause, give them time to find that pause button. So that is it from us today. We have got about 2 minutes if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you very much. And if I may ask a couple of questions. I'm quite interested in knowing what kind of feedback you got from parents or students that really made you modify the format that you use. Was there anything particularly useful in the feedback that you got that made you think, yes, we need to get this better? Anyone want to take this question?
I'm happy to talk a little bit. I think with our very small primary friends, I think I have and I tend to speak quite quickly. And I think it was about just giving them a little bit more time and ensuring that there was time for them to understand key concepts and practice them. And also the feedback, I think when I first started saying like, my turn, your turn, or like doing silly little things felt really idiotic from my kitchen table. But actually that parents said they really liked that, and that kind of upped the engagement because they felt like they had a real teacher in front of them, and that was really helpful. So those were 2 things that really influenced me.
Thank you. Do we have something similar from a secondary perspective? Okay, so I'll move on to the next question, but thank you. I always wonder if I need to add, you know, more tonal differences and emphasis. in some of the lessons, there is, you might find a piece of text that needs to be read by the students. And I noticed that you tend not to read that aloud, but let people or students read that for themselves. Is there a reason? Are there any reasons behind that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So
Really?
I think importantly is that cognitive load theory talks about audio and visual, and that the two, if you're speaking over the text while they're also reading, that does actually take away from them taking in that material. So sort of our approach is, we might say, here's some text, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to a minute to read through it, and then you might then explain the text or read through with them, just so it's helpful for them to get it in their heads, really.
Oh, thank you. Perhaps a final question would just about, yeah, it's noon now, but a final question, if I may. How long is the ideal video lesson? Is there any research that you've looked at, or any things that you've deliberated over to establish how long those video lessons should ideally be? How long can the kids focus for?
I think that's a tricky one in terms of, the subject and what you're doing. I think what we've looked at more is how regularly you put in those pause points. And so ideally we'd say put in pause points every 1 to 2 minutes, really, so students can pause and do the task. And I guess once you've put those in, you can get a sense of how long a student's going to be taking. Most of our lessons are probably around 20 minutes, because once students have stopped to do that task, then that's probably going to take them to an hour, which is what they'll be used to doing most of the time in school.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I've made loads of notes, and I was just thinking all the way through, okay, I'm going to re-record this one, I'm going to do this differently. So that was very, very helpful, and I'm sure that a lot of people will take a lot of things from your talk. So thank you very much. Have a beautiful day. I know that you're very, very busy people. So thank you for taking the time, and have a great day. All right, everyone. So I hope you've enjoyed the session. Tomorrow we'll be talking about teaching spelling with Tarjin Gill. So please do join us. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.